How do you combat bad information? Yeah, I know this isn't a comics topic. It's a whole, fake news or Russian bots or, people basically putting out information that is clearly wrong for various reasons, or maybe just out of ignorance. How do you fight that? How do you combat that? How do you set the record straight? Well, in comics, it is a problem because it's leading to a lot of churn, a lot of anger, a lot of confusion, and a lot of just base misconceptions. So let's talk about some of those. Hey everybody, this is Perch. Obviously, you've been listening to the videos in the past. I've talked about the kind of weird way that facts get misrepresented in comics. And sometimes it's simply kind of a misunderstanding of things. Like, for example, when we've talked about returnability and comics that are, basically a comic in the 80s selling 240,000 copies. That was kind of a lower to middle range comic, but then a good portion of those, like 80% of those, would get pulp, ripped up, returned. So they weren't actually being quote unquote sold. It was just how that process worked. And that's one reason why the numbers are higher then than today. But you could still make this argument, based on certain terminology. Yes, in raw numbers, the publisher pushed out more titles then than now. Yes, it definitely matters that a lot of those titles were coming right back again. But, there's some facts in there. It's just misleading how it's being presented. But then there's other things that are said that are just completely wrong. Like, for example, one argument that I've had now twice in the last month is the amount of times Miss Marvel, the title, has been relaunched. How many times there's been a new #1 issue of her ongoing series published? The answer is 3. It isn't an answer that is subjective. It is an answer that is factual. There is only one answer, and that answer is 3. There's not 2 because there were 3 series. It's not 20 because there were 3 series. There's not a different way to look at it. But where that argument has gone is people have said, no, Miss Marvel is being relaunched over 50 times. How do people get to that? Well, by counting variants as separate series. Now, obviously, that's stupid, but the basics is, look, here is a cover. It's got a piece of art and a #1 on top of it. Here is a different cover, and it has a #1 on it. Thus, it is 2 separate relaunched comics. No, it's a variant. But there's a lot of these kind of details, and twice in both of these arguments that I had, there's a third where the guy came around. But in the other 2, the one guy said, "Well, your facts are wrong." It's like, my facts aren't wrong. This is an easily provable fact. Let me introduce you to Google. It's this thing, and if you don't like Google, you can take its inbred cousin Bing. It's right here too. There's ways that we can find this out for ourselves. The other guy went with well, we can agree to disagree. It's like, but we can't though. We can't agree to disagree on facts. You can't say, hey, if I jump off this building, I am going to turn into a bloody splat on the sidewalk, and the other guy can't say, well, no, that's not true. You'll be fine. You'll bounce off of pavement when pavement, if hit from a certain distance, allows you to bounce. I guess we'll have to agree to disagree. It's like, no, we won't. You're no. But comics has a decent amount of this very bad data, like overships, costing, like the comic store has to pay an extra bill for all the overships. That's one that you've heard. There's another one out there that is Diamond chooses for the comic store what they're going to order. The comic store doesn't actually have any say in what they supply to the shelves, and Diamond chooses for them. And that's why comic stores carry Marvel. Another one, that the crowdfunding side of comic books made more money than the traditional publishing side of comics. And all these statements that I'm making right now are not subjective. They're not opinions. An opinion would be something like, Batman is a lousy title, or Brian Michael Bendis is an amazing writer. Those are opinions. It might work for you. There's no one can say whether it's true or not. That's up to you as a person. But things like, what's another one that comic books all were 40 pages back in the 80s and 90s, and then Marvel and Disney got greedy and cut the books in half. They weren't 40 pages anymore. That's factually not true. Yet it is something that many people believe. There's a lot of little things like that. There's one that says that at Marvel there's a policy for the editors to sleep with the assistant editors, and they're hired for sexual duties. Again, that may be an opinion, that may be some gossip you'd like to carry around, maybe, there's no factual evidence of this. Maybe it's happening. You can speculate. There is definitely not a Disney, Mickey Mouse policy that says that when you're hired in as an assistant editor, part of your duties is to give hand jobs to the editors. That's not in the job description. It's not listed there. So no, Disney's not forcing this to happen. There was a funny one of the that Disney has to hire a certain number of diverse creators, that they've got quotas in place at Disney. Well, I mean, one, that would not be legal. They would have massive problems, and trust me, there are a large number of entities all over that would love to go at Disney for such a thing. But Disney's been protected to some extent from all that. Um, there's facts that get thrown out, and some of it's like the telephone game. And I've noticed this with videos. I've been on a few streams for a few different people. I don't do as many as I used to, just time wise more than anything. But there's the telephone game happens, which is one person will say, I think that e-viewing was hired because Marvel wanted a female voice for Ironheart. And then somebody will hear that video and they'll do a video saying, e-viewing was hired because she's black and female. And then the third person will say, e-viewing was hired over other qualified candidates. Okay, all these things I'm saying right now are opinions. But it slowly transforms. By the time the fourth or the fifth video gets made, somebody is saying something along the lines of, uh, Scott Snyder was scheduled to work at Marvel, but e-viewing took his job because Disney had to fulfill their quota. That's the kind of stuff, and then people say that very with a straight face, and then people hear that, and maybe it's kind of what they want to hear. I don't know, but then they wander onto message boards and social media and other places, and they just start blabbing that stuff away. It is the same effect, by the way, just to put it into perspective for you guys. You remember when all those people wrote the Comicsgate is a hate group articles, and there was like a bunch of them over a course of like a month. Seemed like a dozen different B and C level news websites all published little articles about things, and they all kind of told the story of the milkshake crew going out for a milkshake, and and that some hateful trolls made fun of them, and that kicked off comic civil war. Well, what you might notice from those articles, if you go read them, is that almost all of them, particularly the ones that came later, not the first wave, all started to neglect Flo. And I did a video on this, Flo being the Marvel staffer turned not Marvel staffer turned return to Marvel, well loved within the comic industry, and the reason behind some of this. All of these articles started to forget that fact. Flo became unimportant as to why this stuff. Instead, the articles were written as, a handful of female editors just wandered into a place to get a milkshake, minding their own business, doing nothing wrong, and then a bunch of racist, sexist people came in and started making fun of their butts, and that's where. And then Civil War happened. They all kind of neglected to mention that fact. I did a whole video on this of why that whole thing is irksome. But all around, the way people remember those events is very subjective to kind of their particular ideology. And what's crazy about it is there's facts. I had people on both sides. It was a fun week when I did that video. I had people both directions kind of arguing with me that, number one, no, the tribute to Flo came later, and it was actually fake. I had one person say that Flo wasn't a real person and was invented by Heather Ontos as a way to kind of smear white men. That was a fun one. I had somebody argue that Stanley and Jack Kirby, there never was a Flo, and they were, they did all the work. And then I had it from the other direction as well, which was no, from the very first second, people were going at Mark Wade and other things. And it's like, no, what you're saying the timeline doesn't make sense. I'm sorry, if you just look at the timeline of events, and a lot of the stuff is recorded, like you can go back and see the tweets or see the stuff yourself. Somebody can delete a tweet, but they can't go back and edit a tweet. I wish they could, because I make typos on a constant basis on Twitter. But there's some records there. There's some dates. You can look at the date, and and then that gets into, like, it's amazing how far people go to defend themselves, defend their kind of weird conspiracy entrenchment. I've got that Twitter corporate will modify the dates on tweets for the important people, for the left wing. They'll change it. It's like, guy, you're pushing too hard for what is too simple of a thing. At any rate, look, I think the comics and our enjoyment and our discussion and our dialogues and our fun in comics is assisted and aided when we work from facts. I think the wonderful part about comics and movies and entertainment in general is there are big parts of it that are completely up to the reader or the viewer. There is a subjective aspect to it, which is amazing, which means that everybody gets their own individual cool little experience. That's a good thing. But what's lousy in that is that the tiny amount of facts, the actual platform that we have, when we start arguing about that, then we're living in just crazy town. We're living in a world where people are going to be angry at Marvel because they cut the pages from 40 down to 20 some point in the 90s. You start getting mad at, you run these conspiracy theories. Another one that's made its rounds on the internet is that Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, when they left to form the Image Six and that company and that whole business, they did so because, dun dun dun, Joe Quesada was forcing them to change characters to minority versions of themselves. And I don't even know what to say to that. Joe Quesada wasn't with Marvel at that point. It's like, this wasn't. No, it doesn't make any sense. What you're saying doesn't make any sense. That's the kind of stuff where it just burns a lot of energy, it burns a lot of effort, and it takes away from our enjoyment of comics because we're fighting over nonsense things and we're letting ourselves get worked up over nonsense things. Not everything is a fight like this. Not everything needs to be. Anyway, all right, that's enough on that subject. What do you think? What are some of those facts out there that are just they're facts, and they're not disputable? They are facts. The definition of a fact, something that is provable, that is set in stone, that does not have a subjective aspect to it. What are some of those out there in comics that you've heard here? What are the wildest theories you've ever heard? What are the stuff you find yourself arguing with people about that are not opinions? And by the way, it's not like the X-Men is the greatest team ever. That's an opinion. Saying that Captain America used to be leader of the X-Men. That is a fact. It's not a fact, it's a lie. That's the kind of stuff that we just need to step away from that silliness, I think. That's what we need to do. Anyway, leave your thoughts, leave your comments. Would love to hear your craziest things you've ever come across. Let's all have a laugh together. Like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch, where you can see me interacting with lots of people saying crazy things on a regular basis. But right here, right now, thanks for listening.